Washington marches south with French allies. The French Navy blocks to sea. The trap is set. For weeks, cannon fire rains down on the British camp. The ground shakes. The air burns. Washington orders the assault. His men storming the redoubts, bayonets gleaming in the firelight. In the beginning, there was silence. Then came the gunfire. The year was 1775, and the world was about to change forever. 13 colonies stood at the edge of rebellion. Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants faced the mightiest empire on earth. To Britain, they were subjects totem selbst. They were something else entirely, a people ready to claim power. But power never comes without blood. It began with a tax and ended with a war. The Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the chains of empire tightening around the colonies. Each law, each insult, lit another fuse. In Boston, the streets boiled with rage when Keene's soldiers fired into a crowd. 5 colonists fell, and history called it the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, when rebels dumped British tea into the harbor, the Crown called them traitors. But across the colonies, people whispered a dangerous word: freedom. The British responded with force, but the harder they struck, the stronger the resistance grew. And soon, whispers turned to war. It was still dark on the morning of April 19, 1775, when British troops marched toward Lexington. They came to seize weapons and to silence rebellion. But on a cold field of dawn, a handful of farmers stood in their way. No one knows who fired first, but one shot cracked the air, and in that single moment, the fate of an empire began to crumble. The world would remember it as the shot heard around the world. The colonies rose like wildfire. From Massachusetts to Virginia, men picked up muskets and marched. But revolution was chaos. They had no uniforms, no training, no strategy, only belief. And belief met reality at Bunker Hill, where blood turned the grass red. The Americans lost the hill, but won something far greater: courage. At the center of it all stood a tall, solemn figure, George Washington. Chosen to lead an army that barely existed, he faced the impossible. Against the red tide of Britain's legions, he had only faith, patience, and the hope of a nation that did not yet exist. The year 1776, the colonies declared independence, but the ink was barely dry when British ships filled the New York harbor. 30,000 troops, cannons gleaming. In a storm of ice and snow, Washington crossed the Delaware River and struck Trenton. The victory was small, but it reignited the flame of freedom. The war was far from won, but hope had returned. 2 years later, the impossible happened. At Saratoga, the Americans defeated a full British army. Cannons thundered through the forest as British General Burgoyne surrendered. For the first time, the world believed the unthinkable: Britain could be beaten. And far across the sea, an old enemy of the empire took notice. France entered the war. Gold, ships, soldiers, and vengeance for past defeats. Now, the revolution was no longer a rebellion. It was a world war. The British struck again, this time in the south. They burned cities, crushed militias, and hunted the rebellion through swamps and back. But the Americans had learned the art of defiance. Guerrilla fighters like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, hit and vanished like ghosts. Every battle lost birthed another spark of resistance. And as the war dragged on, the British found themselves trapped, not by armies, but by an idea that would not die. Autumn 1781. Yorktown, Virginia. General Cornwallis fortifies his position by the bay, unaware that the jaws of history are closing around him. Washington marches south with French allies. The French Navy blocks to sea. The trap is set. For weeks, cannon fire rains down on the British camp. The ground shakes. The air burns. Washington orders the assault. His men storming the redoubts, bayonets gleaming in the firelight. The Americans seize the enemy's strongholds one by one. And then, silence. On October 19th, Cornwallis surrenders, the empire bows to the Republic. The world had turned upside down. The war was over. But victory was not peace. The revolution had created freedom, but now came the harder task to control Italiana. The colonies, once united in battle, now quarreled in peace. 13 states, 13 different ambitions. The new America teetered on the edge of collapse. In Philadelphia, leaders gathered once more. Washington, Franklin, Hamilton, Madison, their mission: to forge unity from chaos. Behind closed doors, they argued, dreamed, and designed something the world had never seen. A government built not on bloodline or empire, but on the people themselves. The United States Constitution became their weapon of peace. The blueprint of power born not from conquest, but from conviction. But power has a cost. The new republic faced its own contradictions. Freedom for some, slavery for others. Justice for the few, silence for the many. The revolution had promised equality, yet the promise remained incomplete. The struggle for power continued, not on battlefields, but in hearts, in politics, in the very soul of the nation. Every generation since has fought that same invisible war. The battle between what America is and what it was meant to be. The old war was more than a fight for independence. It was a confrontation with destiny, a test of whether ordinary men could shape the course of history. They did. From the frozen banks of the Delaware to the burning fields of Yorktown, they proved that freedom could triumph over fear. That power could belong to the people, if they were willing to fight for it. And though centuries have passed, the echoes remain. In every protest, every election, every voice that dares to speak truth to power. The spirit of that war lives on. Empires rise, nations fall. But the idea of freedom endures, because once a people have tasted liberty, no force on earth can ever take it back. This was the war that changed the world. This was the old war, America's struggle for power. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more.